They said she was the kind of woman no man would choose unless he had no other road left to ride. The words hung in the dry air like dust that refused to settle, and Ethan Cole heard every one of them as clearly as the slow creak of saddle leather beneath him. The Lakota camp stretched out before him in a wide circle of earth and firelight, shadows moving against hide tents while the last of the sun slipped behind the ridgeline like it wanted no part in what was about to happen. He had ridden nearly 60 miles across broken land to return a lost boy to his people. That was all. No debt. No bargain. Just a quiet act done because it felt right in a world that rarely did. But out here, nothing stayed simple for long. The moment he crossed that invisible line of territory, he felt it. The shift, the eyes, the silence that carried more weight than a drawn weapon ever could. They did not shout. They did not rush him. They simply watched. And somehow that was worse, because a man could prepare for anger, but not for judgment that had already been decided before he even opened his mouth. Now he stood at the center of their circle, boots pressed into red earth, hat shadowing his eyes, facing Chief Red Hawk, a man who didn't need to raise his voice to command the attention of every soul within 100 yards. The chief studied him the way a storm studies the land before it breaks, not with hate, not even with suspicion, but with something colder, something older. And Ethan understood in that moment that whatever came next wasn't about him alone. It was about what he represented. A stranger, a white man, a history that rode ahead of him whether he wanted it or not. The boy he had brought back stood safe now behind the line of warriors, small hand clutching his mother's dress, eyes wide not with fear, but with recognition. And that should have meant something good, should have been enough. But nothing here worked the way it did back in towns where words could smooth things over and a handshake could settle a score. Here, silence spoke first, and when the chief finally did speak, his voice carried low and steady like wind across open plains. "You crossed our land without asking," he said, and it wasn't an accusation. It was a statement, like saying the sun would rise again whether anyone welcomed it or not. Ethan didn't argue, didn't reach for excuses. He simply nodded once, because anything else would have been a lie dressed up as courage. A few of the younger warriors shifted at that, maybe expecting more, maybe hoping for it. But the chief only lifted a hand, and the movement stopped as if the earth itself had decided to hold still. Then came the words that changed the shape of everything. "You did not come as an enemy," Red Hawk continued, eyes never leaving Ethan's face. "But you came without understanding." A pause, long enough for the fire to crack and the horses at the edge of camp to shift their weight. "So you will learn." Ethan felt the weight of those words settle into his chest before he even knew what they meant. And then it came, simple, clean, and final. "You will marry my daughter, or you will leave this land and never return." There was no threat in it, no raised tone, and somehow that made it heavier than any ultimatum shouted across a saloon floor. A murmur passed through the circle, not loud, but enough to ripple through the gathered crowd like wine through dry grass. Ethan caught fragments of it. Words carried low. "The hidden one, no man stays. Let him choose." And something colder beneath it all, something like pity. He didn't react right away, didn't look around for support. That wasn't there. He just stood, breathing slow, the taste of dust and smoke mixing in his mouth. Because out here, a man's answer wasn't measured by how fast he gave it, but by how steady he stood before he spoke. He had faced hard choices before, storms that split cattle lines, nights with nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat to remind him he was still alive. But this felt different. This wasn't about survival, not in the way most men understood it. This was about something deeper, something tied to respect, to the kind of law that didn't need paper or ink to exist. His eyes drifted, just once, to where the chief's daughter stood at the far edge of the firelight, barely more than a silhouette. Her face hidden behind a veil that caught the glow of the flames and turned it into something almost unreal. No one stood close to her, not even the women of the tribe. And that alone said more than any whispered rumor could. He noticed something else too, something small but sharp, the way the older warriors didn't look at her either, not out of shame, but out of something closer to reverence. And that didn't fit the story he was being handed, not at all. A lesser man might have laughed it off, might have turned his horse and taken his chances on the open land. But Ethan Cole had spent too many years learning that the things that didn't make sense at first were usually the ones worth paying attention to. So he lifted his head, met the chief's gaze without challenge, without submission, just steady, and after a long breath that seemed to stretch the whole camp into silence, he gave the only answer that felt honest. I'll stay. No bargain, no hesitation, just that. And for the first time since he rode in, the air shifted, not lighter, not easier, but different, like something unseen had just taken its first step toward him, and somewhere beyond the circle, a low wind moved through the grass, carrying with it the quiet sense that whatever he had just agreed to was only the beginning of something none of them had fully spoken aloud. The fire burned lower as the night stretched across the plains, and Ethan Cole began to understand that silence here was not emptiness, it was expectation. Every movement around him carried purpose. Every glance avoided something unspoken. The warriors did not celebrate, did not question. They simply shifted positions as if the decision had already been made long before he arrived, a path laid down that he had just stepped onto without seeing it. He noticed how no one approached the veiled woman, not even the elders who moved freely through the camp with quiet authority. They gave her space the way men give distance to something they respect more than they understand. And that detail settled into Ethan's mind like a stone dropped into still water, creating ripples that refused to fade. A young boy passed him carrying a wooden bowl, paused just long enough to look up at him with wide eyes, not mocking, not afraid, but searching, as if trying to figure out why this stranger had not turned his horse and ridden away when he still had the chance. Ethan gave the boy a small nod, the kind that did not ask for trust but offered steadiness, and the boy returned it before moving on. That simple exchange grounding him more than anything else in that moment, because it reminded him that choices were not always about winning or losing. Sometimes they were about standing still when everything else told you to run. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and smoke through the camp, and somewhere behind him a horse let out a soft breath, the kind that comes when an animal senses something changing before people do. Ethan adjusted his stance, boots pressing deeper into the earth, feeling the solid ground beneath him like a promise he could not yet name. He watched as Chief Red Hawk turned slightly, speaking in low tones to one of the elders, their words too quiet to catch, but their expression steady, measured, not once glancing toward Ethan as if his presence was no longer something to debate, but something already woven into what would come next. That realization settled heavier than any threat could have, because it meant this was not a punishment handed out in anger. It was something deliberate, something chosen, and that made it harder to walk away from, harder to dismiss. The fire cracked again, sending a brief shower of sparks into the night air, and for a moment the light caught the edge of the veil covering the woman's face, revealing nothing beneath it but the faint outline of her profile, still as carved stone, unmoving even as the world shifted around her. Ethan found himself watching that stillness more than anything else, because it did not match the whispers he had heard. It did not match the story of someone hidden out of shame or rejection. There was no hesitation in the way she stood, no shrinking, no sign of someone waiting to be judged. Instead, there was something else, something controlled, something that felt closer to choice than circumstance, and that detail tightened. Something in his chest he could not quite name. A group of younger men moved closer to the fire, their voices low but not silent enough to escape notice. He does not know. One of them murmured, and another answered, he will. The words carried no cruelty, no humor, only certainty, and that certainty felt heavier than any insult ever could. Ethan let the words pass through him without reaction, not because they meant nothing, but because reacting would mean admitting he understood more than he actually did. And right now, he did not. Not fully. Not yet. Time stretched in that strange way it does when a man stands at the edge of something unknown, every second longer than it should be, every breath measured. And then movement began again, subtle at first, the elders stepping into position, the circle tightening just enough to shift the space from gathering to ceremony. No one announced it, no one called attention to it, but everyone felt it, the same way a man feels a storm before. He sees the clouds. Ethan straightened slightly, not out of defiance, but out of respect for whatever this moment was becoming. His eyes drifted once more toward the veiled woman, and this time, for just a second, She moved. Not much, just a slight turn of her head, but enough that he felt it, the sense of being seen, truly seen, not as an outsider, not as a stranger, but as someone who had just stepped into a role he did not yet understand. The moment passed as quickly as it came, but it left something behind, something steady, something that made him realize this was no simple test of courage or pride. It was something deeper, something tied to the way people measured worth without ever speaking it aloud. Chief Red Hawk stepped forward again, and the quiet that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. The chief's eyes moved across the circle once, then settled back on Ethan, not questioning now, not weighing, simply acknowledging, as if to say the choice had been made, and the path ahead would reveal the rest. Ethan did not speak, did not need to, because out here, words had already done their work. What mattered now was what a man would do when there was nothing left to say. And as the firelight flickered across the gathered faces, and the night deepened around them, Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had chosen to stand, feeling the weight of that choice settle into something solid, something unshakable, even as the truth of what he had stepped into remained just out of reach, waiting, like the first drop of rain before a storm that had not yet shown its full strength. The circle tightened by inches, not enough for a stranger to notice, but enough for a man who had learned to read the ground beneath his boots, and Ethan Cole felt it the way a rider feels a shift in a horse before it breaks into a run. Something was coming, not fast, not loud, but certain. The elders moved with quiet precision, placing small objects near the fire, bundles of sage, carved pieces of bone, a bowl of water that reflected the flames like a second, trembling sky. None of it explained, none of it announced. Yet every person in that circle understood their place within it, except him, and still, no one rushed him, no one tested him. They simply allowed him to stand there, to exist within their space as if waiting to see what kind of man would emerge when he realized he could no longer lean on what he already knew. Ethan kept his hands loose at his sides, not reaching, not closing, just present, the way his father had taught him long ago. When dealing with things you do not understand, you do not grab. You do not speak too soon. You watch, you listen, and you let the truth come to you in its own time. The fire shifted, casting longer shadows now, and the temperature dropped just enough that he could feel it through his shirt, a reminder that night out here was not gentle. It did not care who you were or what you believed. It simply arrived and asked if you were ready for it. Somewhere beyond the circle a coyote called once, then went quiet. And even that sound seemed to fit into the moment like it had been waiting its turn. Ethan's eyes moved again to the veiled woman, Ayana, though no one had spoken her name yet. He felt it, the way a man sometimes knows a thing before it is told to him. She stood where she had always been, but now the space around her felt different, not empty, not avoided, but held, like the center of something larger than the circle itself. He noticed the ground near her feet, untouched, no footprints crossing too close, no sign of casual movement, and that detail pressed deeper into his understanding. This was not isolation, this was boundary, chosen, respected, and that realization shifted something inside him, because it meant everything he had been told in whispers might not be truth, but protection, a layer placed between her and the kind of eyes that only see what they expect to see. The chief raised his hand once more, and this time the movement carried finality, the kind that does not invite question, only attention. The murmurs faded completely. Even the younger men who had spoken earlier fell silent, their earlier certainty now replaced with something closer to anticipation. Ethan drew a slow breath, the air cool in his lungs, steadying, grounding, because whatever came next would not be explained twice. And out here, a man was expected to understand without being led. Chief Red Hawk spoke again, his voice low but carrying. "You chose to stay," he said, not as praise, not as challenge, simply as fact. Ethan nodded once, nothing more, and the chief continued. "Then you will stand as one who does not turn away." Another pause, not long, but deliberate. "And you will see what others refuse to see." The words settled into the air, and Ethan felt their weight not in his ears, but somewhere deeper. Somewhere that recognized truth even when it came wrapped in something unfamiliar. Two elder women stepped forward now, their movements slow but unwavering. and they approached the veiled figure without hesitation, without fear, as if stepping into a space that welcomed them. One carried a small woven cloth, the other a thin cord with beads that caught the firelight in soft, shifting colors. They did not speak, did not look at Ethan, their attention fixed entirely on the woman before them. And as they reached her, something changed again, subtle, but undeniable. The circle did not close further, but it held tighter, every person present leaning into the moment without moving an inch. The first elder lifted the cloth, brushing it gently across Ayana's shoulders, not to cover, but to mark, a gesture that felt older than words. The second placed the beaded cord into her hands, and for the first time since Ethan had seen her, Ayana moved with intention, her fingers closing around it, steady, controlled, not uncertain, not hesitant. And that single motion told him more than any rumor ever could. This was not a woman being given away. This was a woman stepping forward. And the difference between those two things was as wide as the plains themselves. Ethan felt that realization settle into his bones, heavy and clear, and for a brief moment, doubt flickered, not about staying, but about whether he truly understood what he had agreed to, because this was no longer about a bargain, no longer about a condition set by a chief. This was something else entirely, something that had been set in motion long before he rode into that land. The elders stepped back, leaving Ayana standing alone once more, but now the space around her felt charged, alive with something unseen. The fire cracked again, louder this time, and a gust of wind moved through the circle, lifting the edge of her veil just slightly, not enough to reveal, but enough to remind every man there that what lay beneath it was not meant to be taken lightly. Ethan's gaze did not waver, not out of defiance, but out of respect, because he understood now, in a way he had not before, that looking away would mean missing something important, something that might never be offered again. Chief Red Hawk lowered his hand slowly, and in that motion, the final piece of the moment settled into place. Not spoken, not declared, but understood by all. The path had been chosen, the line had been crossed, and whatever came next would not be undone. And as the firelight danced across the circle and the night pressed closer around them, Ethan Cole stood exactly where he was meant to stand, not as a man forced into something he feared, but as a man who had stepped into something he was only beginning to understand, knowing without knowing why that the truth waiting beneath that veil was not just about her, it was about him, and whether he was ready to see what others never could. The air did not move, yet everything inside that circle shifted, as if something unseen had taken a breath, and Ethan Cole felt it in the way his chest tightened without warning, not fear, not doubt, something sharper, something that told him the moment ahead would not wait for him to be ready. The fire bent slightly as the wind brushed past, and the faint edge of the veil stirred. Again, just enough to remind him that whatever stood before him was not hidden out of weakness, but by choice, a choice the entire camp honored without question. The elders stepped back fully now, clearing the space between Ethan and Ayana, leaving nothing but a stretch of red earth and flickering light between them. And for the first time since he arrived, Ethan understood that the distance was not measured in feet, but in understanding, and he was about to cross it whether he knew how or not. Chief Red Hawk did not speak again, did not need to. His silence was the final command, the kind that carried more weight than any spoken order, and Ethan felt it settle into him like a hand placed firmly on his shoulder, guiding him forward without force, just certainty. He took one step, slow, deliberate, the sound of his boot pressing into the dirt louder than it should have been. Or maybe everything else had simply grown quiet enough to hear it. Another step followed, and then another, until he stood just a few feet from her, close enough to see the fine stitching along the edge of the veil, the way it had been crafted with care, not to hide, but to hold something back until the right moment. And that thought stayed with him, because nothing here felt careless, nothing felt accidental. Even this, even now, the circle behind him remained still, no shifting, no whispers, only watching, not judging him, not pressuring him, but waiting, as if the outcome had already been decided. And all that remained was for him to catch up to it. Ethan stopped where instinct told him to stop, not too close, not too far, the space between them steady, respectful. He did not reach for the veil, not yet, because something inside him understood that this was not his to take. It had to be given. And so he waited, the kind of waiting that did not ask for permission but offered patience. And for a long second, nothing happened. The fire cracked again, a horse shifted somewhere behind him, and the world held its breath. Then she moved, not with hesitation, not with uncertainty, but with intention. Her hand rose slowly, fingers steady as they reached for the edge of the veil, and Ethan felt something in his chest tighten again, not from what he expected to see, but from the realization that this moment had nothing to do with expectation at all. It had everything to do with truth, the kind of truth that does not explain itself, does not soften itself. It simply stands and lets you decide what kind of man you are when you face it. Her fingers paused for just a fraction of a second, not in doubt, but in timing, as if aligning herself with something deeper than the moment. And then, with a motion as calm as the wind moving across open land, she lifted the veil. It did not fall. It did not slip. It was removed with care, folded back just enough to reveal her face to him, and him alone before the firelight carried it outward to the rest of the circle. And what Ethan saw did not strike him like lightning. It did not shock him into stillness. It settled into him, quiet and undeniable. Her face was not what the whispers had painted, not something to be hidden away, not something marked by the kind of flaws people fear. It was strong, composed, carrying lines of experience that spoke of more than years. Her eyes met his without hesitation, steady, clear, and in them he saw something he had not expected, not vulnerability, not defiance, but recognition, as if she had been waiting not for a man to arrive, but for a man to understand. The kind of understanding that does not come from stories told in low voices, but from standing still long enough to see what is actually in front of you. Ethan did not step back, did not look away, and that mattered more than anything he could have said, because in that moment, words would have been smaller than the truth. Standing between them, behind him, something shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to feel the subtle sound of movement as warriors lowered their gaze, not in shame, but in respect, and that detail struck Ethan harder than anything else, because it told him this was never about forcing a stranger into something he did not want. It was about finding the one who would not turn away when the truth revealed itself. Ayanna lowered her hand slowly, the veil now resting behind her shoulders, no longer a barrier, but a choice completed, and for a brief moment, the firelight caught the beaded cord in her hand, reflecting small points of light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the moment. Ethan's breath came steady, controlled, but inside, something had shifted, something that did not have a name yet, only a presence, a weight that told him the road ahead was no longer about proving anything to anyone else. It was about whether he could stand in this truth without trying to change it, without trying to fit it into something smaller, something easier. Chief Red Hawk finally moved, just one step forward, enough to enter the edge of the firelight, his eyes moving from his daughter to Ethan, and in that glance there was no question left, only confirmation, the kind a man gives when he has seen what he needed to see. And for the first time since the circle formed, the silence broke, not with noise, but with understanding, the kind that spreads without needing to be spoken. And as the night deepened around them, and the fire burned steady at the center of it all, Ethan Cole realized that the moment he thought would define everything was only the beginning of something far greater, something that would not be measured by what he saw when the veil was lifted, but by what he chose to do now that nothing stood between him and the truth. No one spoke after the veil fell, and that silence carried more meaning than any celebration ever could. Ethan Cole stood where he was, the firelight steady against his face, and for the first time since he rode into that land, he understood that this was never about appearance, never about some whispered flaw meant to scare men away. It was about whether a man could stand in front of something real, without trying to reshape it into something easier to accept. Ayanna did not look away. Her eyes remained on him, calm, unwavering, not asking for approval, not offering explanation, simply present. And that presence held a kind of strength that did not need to be proven. It simply existed. The kind of strength that made other men lower their gaze not because they were told to, but because they chose to, and that choice echoed through the circle behind him as the warriors remained still, their posture no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but settled, As if a question they had carried for a long time had finally been answered. Ethan felt that shift, not in their movement, but in the absence of it, the quiet acceptance that spread without a single word being spoken. He drew a slow breath, letting it out just as steady. Because this moment demanded more than reaction, it demanded understanding, and understanding took time, even when the truth stood right in front of you. Ayana lowered her gaze just slightly, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, a gesture that felt deliberate, measured, and then she spoke, her voice soft but clear, carrying just enough to reach him without needing to rise. "You did not leave," she said, and there was no judgment in it, only fact. Ethan shook his head once. "No," he answered, his voice low, steady, matching the tone she had set, because anything louder would have felt like a disruption to something that was meant to unfold without force. She studied him for a brief moment, not searching for weakness, but for truth, and whatever she saw seemed to settle something within her, because her shoulders eased just enough to notice, and that small change told him more than any words could have. Behind him, Chief Red Hawk stepped fully into the firelight now, his presence grounding the space once more. His eyes moved between them, not as a judge, but as a witness. And when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of something long decided. "Many have been given this path," he said, his tone even. "Many turned away before they reached it." Ethan did not respond, did not need to, because he understood what was being said without needing it explained. The chief continued. They saw only what they were told to see. A pause, long enough for the fire to crack again, and they chose to believe it. The words settled into Ethan's chest, not as criticism, but as truth, simple and unadorned, and he realized then that what he had done was not extraordinary. It was simply different. He had not believed the whispers, not fully, not enough to let them decide for him. And that difference had brought him here, to this moment, to this woman standing in front of him without disguise, without pretense. Ayana lifted her hand again, not to cover her face this time, but to hold the beaded cord she had been given earlier. She looked at it briefly, then extended it toward him, not as an offering, not as a demand, but as something in between, something that required a choice. Ethan did not reach for it immediately. He looked at her first, making sure he understood what was being given, and when she gave the slightest nod, he stepped forward that final inch and accepted it, his fingers closing around the beads, feeling their weight, their texture, something crafted with intention, something that carried meaning beyond its form. And as he held it, he felt the shift complete, not around him, but within him, the understanding that this was not a condition he had agreed to out of circumstance. It was a path he had stepped onto by choice, and now he was being asked to continue walking it. The chief watched this exchange without interruption, and when Ethan lifted his eyes again, their gazes met, steady, equal, and for a brief moment, something passed between them that did not need to be spoken. Respect, not given lightly, not taken easily, but earned in the quiet space between decision and action. The wind moved again, stronger this time, carrying the scent of the plains through the camp, and with it came a subtle release, as if the land itself had acknowledged what had just taken place. The circle loosened, not breaking, but easing, the tension that had held it together shifting into something calmer, something steadier. Ethan glanced once more at Ayana, and this time, he did not see mystery. He saw clarity, not in the sense of having all the answers, but in knowing that the answers would come if he stayed long enough to understand them. She turned slightly then, not away from him, but toward the fire, as if inviting him to stand beside her rather than in front of her, and that small movement changed everything, because it was no longer about facing one another. It was about standing together within something larger than either of them. Ethan stepped into place beside her, the beaded cord still in his hand, the firelight casting both their shadows across the ground as one shape instead of two. And in that moment, he realized that the decision he had made was no longer his alone. It had become something shared, something that would unfold in ways he could not yet see, but was now ready to face, not because he understood it fully, but because he had chosen not to turn away from it when it mattered most. The fire settled into a steady glow, no longer crackling with tension but breathing slow, like something that had accepted what had just been decided. And Ethan Cole felt that shift in the way his shoulders eased without him realizing it. not from comfort, but from clarity, the kind that comes when a man stops fighting what he does not understand and starts standing inside it instead. Beside him, Ayana did not speak, did not rush the moment forward. She simply stood with the same quiet strength she had shown from the beginning, her presence no longer distant, no longer veiled, but fully there, and that made everything feel different, not easier, but honest. The circle began to move again, not breaking apart, but flowing, like water finding its path after being held back. Warriors stepped away from the fire in slow, deliberate motion. Elders returned to their places, and the camp resumed its rhythm without a single command given, as if everyone understood that what needed to happen had already happened, and the rest would unfold in its own time. Ethan glanced down at the beaded cord in his hand, turning it slightly between his fingers, feeling the weight of it, not heavy, but certain, each bead worn just enough to tell him it had been held before, carried through moments that mattered, and now it was his to carry forward. That thought did not bring pride. It brought responsibility, the kind that settles quietly and stays. Ayana shifted then, taking a step away from the center of the firelight, not leaving him, but moving with purpose, and after a brief moment, Ethan followed, not because he was told to, but because it felt like the next step on a road he had already chosen. They walked side by side through the camp, not touching, not speaking, but aligned, and as they passed, people did not stare, did not whisper. They acknowledged, subtle nods, small gestures, the kind given to those who had stepped into something recognized, something understood without explanation. That absence of curiosity struck Ethan more than anything else, because it meant this was not new to them. It was only new to him. They reached the edge of the main circle where the firelight softened into shadow, and Ayana stopped, turning slightly to face him, her eyes steady in the dim glow. "You see now," she said, her voice low, carrying no question, only observation. Ethan considered her words, not rushing to answer, because what he saw was still forming, still settling into something he could name. "I see enough," he replied finally, and it was the truth. Even if it was not the whole of it, she nodded once, as if that was all that was required. Not certainty, not full understanding, just the willingness to continue. The wind moved again, brushing past them, lifting a strand of her hair into the light before letting it fall back into place. And in that small, ordinary motion, Ethan saw something he had not expected, not mystery, not distance, but something familiar, something human. And that realization grounded him more than anything else, because it reminded him that whatever she carried, whatever this path held, it was not beyond him. It was simply different from what he had known. A low voice called from behind them, and Ethan turned to see an older man approaching, his steps measured, his gaze calm. There was no tension in his posture, no test in his expression, only purpose. He stopped a few feet away, acknowledging both of them with a slight incline of his head before speaking. "The night does not wait," he said, his tone even, "and neither does the path you have chosen." Ethan listened, understanding that these words were not instruction, but reminder. The man continued, "There are things you will be shown, not told." A pause, just long enough to let the meaning settle. "And what you carry will matter more than what you say." His eyes flicked briefly to the beaded cord in Ethan's hand, then back to his face. And in that glance, Ethan understood that this was not a token, not a symbol meant to be admired. It was a measure, something that would reflect the kind of man he chose to be moving forward. The man stepped back then, leaving them in the quiet once more, his presence fading into the rhythm of the camp as if he had never interrupted it at all. Ethan let out a slow breath, feeling the weight of what had just been said settle alongside everything else. And for a moment, he allowed himself to simply stand there, not moving forward, not stepping back, just present, because he had learned long ago that rushing a path you do not yet understand only leads you further from it. Ayana turned again, this time looking out toward the open land beyond the camp, where the darkness stretched wide and endless under a sky filled with stars. "Tomorrow," she said softly, "you will understand more." There was no promise in it, no reassurance, just a statement of what would come. Ethan followed her gaze, taking in the vastness of the land, the quiet strength of it, and for the first time since he arrived, He felt something settle inside him that was not uncertainty, not tension, but readiness. Not because he knew what lay ahead, but because he no longer needed to. He had stepped into something real, something that would not bend to expectation. And that was enough? He looked back at her, meeting her eyes once more, and gave a small nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, that he was still here, still choosing to stay. And as the night deepened around them and the camp moved in quiet harmony behind them, Ethan Cole understood that the path he had accepted was no longer something placed before him. It was something he was now part of, something that would reveal itself step by step, not through force, not through demand, but through the simple act of not turning away when it mattered most. The night stretched long and quiet across the plains, but it was not an empty quiet. It was the kind that held weight, the kind that pressed against a man's thoughts until he either faced them or let them bury him. And Ethan Cole did neither. He simply lay awake beneath a sky scattered with stars, the beaded cord resting in his hand, turning it slowly between his fingers as if it might speak if he listened hard enough. The camp had settled into rest. Fires burned low, voices faded into murmurs, and the steady rhythm of breathing horses blended with the whisper of wind moving through the grass. Everything felt still, but not asleep, as if the land itself remained aware, watching, waiting, and Ethan could not shake the feeling that he was being measured, not by the people around him, but by something deeper, something older than any man standing in that circle earlier. He closed his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to listen, to feel, because out here, a man learned more by paying attention to what was not said than what was. And in that silence, he began to understand something he had missed before. This was not about proving himself to them. It was about proving something to himself, whether he could remain steady when everything familiar had been stripped away, whether he could stand in a place where the rules were not written in words but in actions, in patience, in respect. A soft movement nearby broke his thoughts, and when he opened his eyes, he saw Ayanna standing a short distance away, her silhouette outlined by the faint glow of dying embers. She had not made a sound, had not called his name. She simply stood there as if she had always been part of that moment, and somehow that felt natural, not surprising. He pushed himself up slowly, brushing the dust from his shirt, and walked toward her, stopping a few feet away, the same distance he had learned to hold earlier, not out of uncertainty, but out of understanding. She looked at him for a long second, her expression calm, unreadable in the dim light. Then she turned without a word and began to walk toward the edge of the camp, not checking if he followed, not asking him to, but expecting it in a way that did not need to be spoken. Ethan hesitated only for a breath before stepping after her, his boots silent against the earth. They moved past the last of the tents, beyond the faint glow of the fires, into the open land where the darkness stretched wide and deep, the stars above sharper now, brighter, like something closer than it had been before. The air cooler out here, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant water. Ayanna stopped near a low ridge, looking out over the land, and Ethan stepped beside her, his gaze following hers, taking in the vastness of it, the kind of space that made a man feel small, but not in a way that weakened him, in a way that reminded him there was more beyond what he could see. She spoke then, her voice quiet but clear. "This land remembers," she said, and the words settled into the night as if they belonged there. Ethan did not answer right away. He let the meaning of it sit, turning it over the way he had with the beads, because he knew better than to rush understanding when it was offered slowly. "Remembers what?" he asked finally, his tone steady, not challenging, just seeking. She glanced at him briefly before looking back out. "Those who take," she said, "and those who stay." The words were simple, but they carried something heavier beneath them, something that reached beyond the moment, beyond him. Ethan felt that weight settle, and for a brief second, he thought of the miles he had ridden, the choices he had made, the times he had walked away when staying would have been harder, and he realized that this, right here, was different, not because of where he was, but because he had chosen not to leave when it would have been easier to do so. Ayanna took a step forward, placing her hand lightly against a weathered stone at the edge of the ridge, her fingers resting there as if connecting to something unseen. "You think this was about me?" she said softly, and Ethan felt the words before he fully understood them. She turned then, meeting his gaze directly. It was not. The statement did not accuse, did not challenge. It simply corrected, and that correction shifted something inside him, not breaking it, but reshaping it. He frowned slightly, not in confusion, but in thought, because he knew there was more to what she was saying, and he waited, giving her the space to continue if she chose to. After a moment, she did. Many men were offered the same choice, she said. They saw only what they feared. A pause, her eyes steady on his. And they left. Ethan let out a slow breath, the truth of that settling into him. He had heard the whispers, had felt the weight of them, but he had not let them decide for him. Not fully, not enough to turn away, and now he understood that was the difference. Not strength, not courage, just the willingness to stand still when others walked away. Ayanna studied him for another moment, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something only she could see. Tomorrow, she said, her voice softer now, you will be asked to do more than stay. The words carried no warning, no threat, just certainty, and Ethan felt them settle into him the same way everything else had. Steady, unavoidable. He looked out across the land again, the horizon barely visible in the darkness, and for the first time, he did not wonder what was coming. He simply accepted that it would come, and that he would meet it the same way he had met everything else here, by not turning away. He glanced back at her, meeting her eyes once more, and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as agreement, but as acknowledgement, that whatever this path required next, he was still walking it. And as the wind moved softly across the ridge and the stars burned steady above them, Ethan Cole understood that the quiet of this night was not an ending, it was a threshold, and by stepping into it, he had already begun to cross into something that would ask more of him than he had ever given before, and somehow, that did not unsettle him. It steadied him. Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in slow, like the land was deciding whether to reveal itself or keep its secrets a little longer, and Ethan Cole felt it before he saw it. The shift in air, the faint warmth brushing against the chill of night, the quiet stir of life returning to the camp behind him. He had not slept much, not because he could not, but because something in him refused to close its eyes when everything around him felt like it was still speaking, even in silence. Beside him, Ayanna stood where she had been, as if the passing of hours meant nothing to her, her gaze still fixed on the horizon where the first light began to stretch across the land, soft and pale, turning shadows into shape. This is where it begins, she said quietly, her voice carrying just enough to reach him without breaking the stillness. Ethan followed her gaze, watching as the light revealed more of the world that had been hidden only moments before, hills rising in the distance, grass bending under the morning breeze, a narrow line of water catching the light like a blade laid across the earth. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden, just clarity replacing mystery, and he understood that this was not about what he would see, it was about how he would see it. Ayanna turned then, her expression steady. Walk with me, she said, not as a request, not as a command, simply as the next step, and Ethan nodded once. Stepping forward beside her without hesitation, they moved away from the ridge, down into the open stretch of land beyond the camp, the ground firm beneath their boots, marked by faint trails that spoke of paths walked many times before, but never worn into something permanent, because out here, nothing was meant to be owned, only understood. The sun climbed higher, the light growing stronger, and with it came a sense of exposure, not uncomfortable, but undeniable, as if the land itself was asking to be seen without shadow. They walked in silence for a long while, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was no need to fill the space. Every step carried meaning, every breath felt measured against something larger than either of them. After a time, they reached a place where the land opened wider, a shallow valley stretching out with a single tree standing near its center, weathered, alone, but not fragile, its branches reaching outward like they had learned to survive without needing anything else. Ayanna stopped there, her eyes resting on the tree. Many come here, she said softly, but not all understand why. Ethan looked at the tree, then back at her, waiting, because he had learned by now that answers here were not given before the right moment. She stepped closer to the tree, placing her hand against its rough bark. The same way she had touched the stone the night before. "This place shows what a man carries," she said, her voice steady. "Not what he says, not what he believes, but what he carries when no one is watching." The words settled into Ethan slowly, not as instruction, but as reflection, and he felt the beaded cord in his hand again, the weight of it more noticeable now. As if it had been waiting for this moment, he stepped forward, stopping a few feet from the tree, not reaching for it yet, because something told him that this was not about touching it. It was about standing before it honestly, without pretense, without trying to shape the moment into something easier. The wind moved through the valley, brushing against him, carrying with it a quiet pressure, not force, not demand, just presence. And for a moment, everything else seemed to fall away. The camp, the distance, even Ayana's presence faded slightly into the background, leaving only him and the space in front of him. And in that space, something surfaced, not a memory, not a thought, but a feeling, something he had carried for a long time without naming it. The weight of choices made, of paths taken and left behind, of moments where he had walked away because staying would have meant facing something he did not understand. And now, standing there, he felt those moments gather, not accusing, not judging, just present. Ayana's voice broke through gently, not interrupting, but guiding. "Do not hide from it," she said, and Ethan realized then that this was the test, not of strength, not of courage, but of honesty, the kind that does not allow a man to look away from himself. He drew a slow breath, steadying, and let the feeling settle instead of pushing it aside, because that was what he had done before, turned away from things that felt too heavy to hold. But here, now, there was nowhere to turn, and more importantly, no reason to. The moment stretched, quiet and full, and then something shifted, not in the land, not in the air, but in him, a small, almost imperceptible change, like a door opening just enough to let light through. And with it came a clarity he had not expected, not about everything, not about the future, but about himself, about the fact that he had chosen to stay, not because he had to, but because something in him refused to leave without understanding, and that choice mattered more than anything else. He lifted his eyes, looking at the tree again, and this time, he did not see something to face. He saw something that had already accepted him standing there, not perfect, not complete, but willing. Ayana stepped back then, giving him space, her gaze calm, not evaluating, not measuring, just present, and after a moment, she gave a small nod, as if confirming what she had seen without needing to say it. "Now you begin to carry it," she said softly, and Ethan felt those words settle into him, not as an end, but as a beginning, because whatever this path required next, it would not be about proving anything to her, or to the tribe, or even to the land. It would be about continuing to stand in that truth without turning away. And as the sun rose fully over the valley, and the shadows retreated into nothing, Ethan Cole understood that the hardest part of the journey was not what lay ahead. It was what he had just faced, and the fact that he had not stepped back from it when he had every chance to do so. The wind did not stop when the moment passed. It carried on across the valley as if nothing had changed, but Ethan Cole knew better, because something had shifted, not in the land, not in the sky, but in the way he stood within it. The weight he felt was not heavier. It was clearer, like a burden that had finally been named instead of carried without thought. He looked once more at the tree, its branches unmoving now, its presence steady, and he understood that it had not judged him, had not measured him against anything but himself, and that was why it mattered. Behind him, Ayana remained quiet, giving him the space to finish what he had begun without interruption, and after a long breath, Ethan stepped back, not retreating, but completing the moment, acknowledging it for what it was, not something to conquer, but something to accept. The sun had risen fully now, casting long lines of light across the valley, turning every detail sharp and visible, nothing hidden, nothing softened, and that clarity felt different from the darkness of the night before. This was not mystery. This was truth laid bare. Ayana moved then, stepping forward to stand beside him again, her presence no longer distant, no longer something he needed to reach for. It was simply there, aligned with him, and she spoke without looking away from the horizon. "Most men leave after this," she said quietly, and the words settled between them with a calm. Certainty, not as warning, not as expectation, just fact. Ethan glanced at her, then back at the land, considering it, not dismissing it, because he knew now that every word she spoke carried meaning beyond what it seemed. Why? He asked, his tone steady, not defensive, just seeking. She took a moment before answering, as if weighing how much needed to be said. Because they see themselves clearly for the first time. She replied, and they do not like what they find. Ethan felt that settle into him, not as something distant, but as something close, because he had felt it too. That moment where everything stripped away and only the truth remained. And he understood how easy it would have been to turn away from it, to ride out of that valley and never look back, to convince himself that it did not matter, that it was just another strange place with strange ways. But he had not done that. And now he understood that choice had set him apart in a way he had not fully realized until now. Ayanna turned slightly, her eyes meeting his. You did not leave, she said again. But this time the words carried something more, not just observation, but recognition, and Ethan nodded once, not out of pride, but because it was simply the truth. The wind shifted again, stronger now, moving through the valley with purpose, bending the grass in long waves that rolled outward as far as he could see. And in that movement, Ethan felt something else, something that had been building quietly since the moment he stepped into this land. A sense of direction, not a path laid out in front of him, but a pull, a quiet understanding that whatever came next would not be random. It would be connected to everything that had already happened. Ayanna stepped away from the tree then, beginning to walk back toward the camp, and Ethan followed without hesitation, the distance between them steady, not forced, not uncertain, just natural. As they moved, the land behind them seemed to settle, as if the valley had released them from its hold, not rejecting them, but acknowledging that what needed to be seen had been seen. The camp came back into view slowly, the shapes of tents and figures moving within, them becoming clearer with each step, the rhythm of life returning. People preparing for the day, fires being rekindled, voices rising just enough to carry across the open space. But there was something different now, something subtle but unmistakable. As they approached, the people did not just acknowledge them. They watched, not with curiosity, not with suspicion, but with a quiet awareness, as if they knew what had taken place beyond the ridge without needing to witness it. Ethan felt that attention, not heavy, not uncomfortable, but present, and he did not shy away from it. He met it the same way he had met everything else here, steady, without trying to explain himself, without trying to prove anything, because he understood now that explanation had no place here. Only action did. They reached the edge of the camp, and Ayanna slowed, turning slightly toward him. Today, you carry it among others, she said, her voice calm, but there was a shift in it, something that hinted at what was coming, not heavier, but broader. And Ethan understood that whatever he had faced alone in the valley would now be tested in a different way, not in silence, but in the presence of others. He glanced down briefly at the beaded cord still in his hand, then back up at her, and for a moment, he felt the full weight of what that meant, not as a burden, but as a responsibility, the kind that does not ask for comfort, only for honesty. He gave a small nod, not because he fully understood what would come next, but because he was no longer waiting to understand before moving forward. And as they stepped fully back into the life of the camp, the sounds, the movement, the quiet acknowledgement of those around them, Ethan Cole realized that the test had not ended in the valley. It had only changed form, and whatever came next would not ask him who he was when he stood alone. It would ask him who he was when others were watching, and whether he would remain the same man when it mattered most. The camp did not pause for him. It moved as it always had, steady and purposeful. And that was the first thing Ethan Cole noticed as he stepped fully back into it. Nothing had changed on the surface. Fires were tended, water was carried, horses were checked, voices rose and fell in quiet conversation. But beneath that, something had shifted, not in the way people acted, but in how they saw him. He could feel it in the glances that met his without hesitation, in the way no one questioned his presence now. No one measured him the way they had when he first arrived. They simply acknowledged, as if he had crossed something unseen and was now part of the pattern rather than standing outside it. Ayanna walked beside him for a few more steps before stopping near the center of the camp. where the ground was worn from years of movement and gathering. She turned to face him, her expression calm, but there was a quiet intensity behind it now, something that spoke of what was coming next. "You stood alone," she said, her voice steady. "Now you stand where others will see." Ethan held her gaze, understanding that the meaning had shifted. This was no longer about what he carried in silence. It was about how that weight showed itself when he was no longer alone. He gave a small nod, not out of certainty, but out of readiness, because he knew better now than to wait until he understood everything before taking the next step. Ayanna studied him for a moment longer, then stepped aside, not leaving, but creating space. And in that space, the camp seemed to adjust, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. People moving closer, forming a loose circle that felt familiar, not the same as the night before, but connected to it. The same quiet expectation settled into the air. The same stillness that asked without words, "Who are you now?" Ethan stood where he was, not shifting, not stepping forward, because he understood that this was not something to approach. It was something that would come to him. Chief Red Hawk stepped into the space then, his presence grounding everything once more, his eyes steady, not searching, not questioning, simply observing. And when he spoke, his voice carried the same calm weight it always had. "A man alone can choose many paths," he said, the word slow, deliberate, "but a man among others shows which path he has chosen." Ethan listened, letting the meaning settle, understanding that what came next would not be about proving something in isolation. It would be about consistency, about whether the man he had been in the valley was the same man he would be here, now, with eyes on him, with presence around him. The chief stepped back slightly, and an elder moved forward, carrying a small wooden bowl. Inside it, water reflected the morning light, clear and still. The elder stopped in front of Ethan, holding the bowl steady, not offering it, not explaining it, simply presenting it. And Ethan understood that this was his moment, not because anyone told him, but because everything in the space pointed to it. He looked at the water, then at the elder, then briefly at Ayanna, who watched without expression, not guiding, not signaling, just present. And he realized that this choice, like the others, would not be explained. It had to come from him. He reached out slowly, taking the bowl in both hands, feeling the coolness of the wood, the slight weight of the water inside. And for a moment, he simply held it, not acting, not rushing, because he knew now that the first instinct was not always the right one. He looked down at the surface of the water, seeing his reflection faintly, distorted by the movement of light, not clear, not perfect, and that felt right, because he was neither of those things, not here, not yet. The camp remained silent, watching, but not pressing, giving him the space to decide what this meant. Ethan took a slow breath, then lowered himself slightly, not kneeling fully, but lowering enough to bring the bowl closer to the ground, to the earth that had held him since he arrived, and with steady hands, he tilted it, letting a small amount of water spill out onto the dirt. The movement simple, controlled, not wasteful, not hesitant, just enough. Then he lifted the bowl again, holding it level, and raised it slightly toward the elder, not as an offering, not as a gesture of return, but as acknowledgement that he understood this was not his to keep entirely, that what he carried belonged as much to the land as it did to him. The elder's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in his posture, something that spoke of acceptance without needing to say it. He took the bowl back, stepping away without a word, and the space held for a moment longer, as if waiting to see if anything more would follow. But nothing did, because nothing needed to. Chief Red Hawk stepped forward once more, his gaze steady on Ethan, and for the first time, there was something new in it, not approval, not praise, but recognition, the kind that is given when a man has shown himself without needing to be told how. "You do not take without giving," the chief said quietly, and the words settled into the air like something that would not be forgotten. Ethan did not respond, did not need to, because he understood that this was not a conversation, it was a confirmation. The circle began to ease again, the tension dissolving into the rhythm of the camp, people returning to their tasks, voices rising slightly, life continuing as it always had, but with one difference. Ethan was no longer outside of it. He stood within it, not as a stranger being tested, But as a man who had begun to show who he was, Ayanna stepped back to his side, her presence steady, and she gave a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, and in that simple gesture, Ethan felt something settle fully into place, not an ending, not a conclusion, but a foundation, something he would carry forward, not because he had to, but because he had chosen to. And as the sun climbed higher over the camp and the day unfolded around them, Ethan Cole understood that the hardest part was no longer facing himself. It was remaining that same man when everything around him continued to move, to change, to test him in ways he could not yet see. And for the first time, he did not question whether he could do it. He simply stood, ready to find out. The day did not slow after that moment. It moved forward with the same steady rhythm as before, but Ethan Cole felt the difference in every step he took, not in the way others treated him, but in how he carried himself among them. The weight in his hands was no longer unfamiliar. The beaded cord rested against his palm like something that had always belonged there, not because it was given, but because he had chosen to accept what came with it. He moved through the camp with purpose now, not wandering, not observing from the outside, but existing within it. And as he passed by others, they did not stop him, did not test him again. They simply acknowledged him with small gestures, nods, brief glances that held meaning without needing words. And that quiet acceptance carried more weight than any challenge ever could, because it meant the question had shifted. It was no longer "Who are you?" It was "What will you do next?" Ayanna walked ahead of him for a time, not leading in a way that guided his steps, but in a way that showed him the path without forcing him to follow it. And Ethan understood that difference clearly now. He was not being led, he was being shown, and what he chose to do with that was his own responsibility. They reached the far side of the camp where the ground rose slightly, giving a view over the surrounding land. And there, a group of elders stood in quiet conversation, their posture calm, their voices low, as if discussing something that did not need urgency. When they noticed Ethan and Ayanna approaching, the conversation did not stop, but it shifted, not toward them, but to include them. And that inclusion spoke louder than any greeting. Ayanna stepped forward first, offering a slight nod, and Ethan followed, mirroring the gesture without overthinking it, because he had learned by now that respect here was shown through simplicity, not display. One of the elders, an older man with eyes that held both weight and clarity, stepped closer, his gaze settling on Ethan without judgment, without expectation, simply present. "You carry it differently," the man said, his voice steady, not questioning, not praising, just observing. Ethan considered the words for a moment before answering, because he knew now that quick responses held little value here. "I carry what I understand," he said finally, his tone even, and the elder nodded once, as if that was enough, because it was. There was no need to explain further, no need to prove anything beyond what had already been shown. The elder glanced briefly at Ayanna, then back at Ethan. "Understanding changes," he said quietly, "and what you carry will change with it." The words settled into Ethan's chest, not as warning, but as truth, and he accepted it without resistance, because he had already seen how each moment here reshaped what he thought he knew. The elder stepped back then, returning to the quiet circle, leaving Ethan and Ayanna standing at the edge once more, and for a brief moment, everything felt still again. Not empty, but balanced, as if the day itself had reached a point of quiet before moving forward again. Ayanna turned slightly, her gaze meeting his. "You see now why they watch," she said softly, and Ethan nodded, because he did. It was not curiosity, it was not doubt, it was awareness, the kind that comes from knowing that what a man does next matters more than what he has already done. The wind moved across the rise, stronger now, carrying the heat of the day with it, and Ethan felt it press against him, not pushing, but reminding. The land did not stop, the path did not pause. It continued, whether he was ready or not. Ayanna looked out over the land again, her expression unchanged, steady as ever. "There is one more step," she said, and Ethan felt those words settle differently than the others, not heavier, but final, the kind that marked the edge of something, not the end, but the point where what came next would define everything that followed. He did not ask what it was, did not seek explanation. because he understood now that asking too soon would only delay what needed to be faced directly. Instead, he gave a small nod, his posture steady, his gaze clear, and waited, because waiting here was not hesitation, it was readiness. The camp behind them continued its quiet rhythm, the sounds of daily life rising and falling, but none of it distracted him now, none of it pulled his attention away from what was coming. Ayanna stepped forward, not toward the camp, not toward the open land, but toward a narrow path that led between the two, a space that felt different, not marked, not defined, but distinct, and Ethan followed without hesitation, his steps matching hers, not out of habit, but out of alignment. The path was not long, but it felt like crossing something, not distance, but understanding, and when they reached the end of it, they stopped, the space around them quiet, separate from the rest of the camp, separate from the open land. And for a moment, nothing happened. Then Ayanna turned to face him fully, her eyes steady, her expression unchanged. But there was something in her gaze now that had not been there before, something deeper, something that carried the weight of everything that had led to this point. "Now you choose," she said, and the words settled into the space between them with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan felt the weight of that moment, not pressing down on him, but grounding him, because he understood now that this was not about what had been asked of him before, it was about what he would choose without being told, without being guided, without being given a path to follow. And in that understanding, he realized something simple, something that had been building since the moment he arrived. He had already made his choice, not once, but over and over again, in every step, in every moment where he could have turned away and did not. And now, standing here, he did not need to search for the answer. He simply needed to speak it. And as the wind moved through the space around them and the light of the day settled fully over the land, Ethan Cole stood steady, ready to choose, not because he was certain of what lay ahead, but because he was certain of who he had become by staying. The space between them did not feel empty, it felt full, filled with everything that had led to this moment, every step, every silence, every choice that had brought Ethan Cole to stand exactly where he was now. And for the first time since he rode into this land, there was no uncertainty left in him, not because he understood everything, but because he no longer needed to. Ayanna's eyes remained on him, steady, patient, not urging him forward, not holding him back, simply waiting, because this was not something that could be guided. It had to come from him alone. The wind moved lightly across the ground, carrying the warmth of the sun and the quiet weight of the land itself, and Ethan felt it settle into him, grounding him in a way that left no room for hesitation. He drew a slow breath, steady, controlled, and when he spoke, his voice matched the stillness around them. "I stay." The words were simple, but they carried everything that had built behind them, not just the decision of a moment, but the continuation of every choice he had made since the beginning. Ayanna did not react immediately, did not nod, did not smile. She simply held his gaze for a long second, as if measuring not the words, but the truth behind them, and whatever she saw there was enough, because she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not as approval, but as acknowledgement that the choice had been made fully, without doubt. She stepped back then, just slightly, creating space once more, but this time it felt different, not like distance, but like transition, as if the moment had shifted from question to answer, from uncertainty to direction. And in that shift, Ethan felt something settle deeper within him, something solid, something that would not change with the next step, the next challenge, the next unknown. The camp beyond them remained in motion, unaware of the exact moment, but connected to it all the same, the rhythm of life continuing without pause, because what had just happened did not need witness to hold meaning. It existed on its own, independent, complete. Ayanna turned slightly, her gaze moving toward the open land beyond the narrow path, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a different tone now, not questioning, not guiding, but certain. "Then you walk it with me," she said, and the words did not feel like an invitation. They felt like a statement of what was already true. Ethan nodded once, because there was nothing else to say, nothing else to decide. The path ahead was no longer something to consider. It was something to walk. Together, they stepped forward, leaving the space behind them, not looking back, because there was nothing left there that needed to be held onto. The ground beneath their feet felt the same. The air felt the same, but everything else had changed, not outwardly, not in a way others would see, but in the way they moved through it, aligned, steady, carrying something shared, something chosen. As they re-entered the open stretch between the camp and the land beyond, the wind picked up slightly, moving around them, through them, like it was acknowledging the shift without needing to speak it. And in that moment, Ethan understood something clearly. This had never been about becoming something new. It had been about uncovering something that was already there, something that only revealed itself when a man chose not to turn away. Ayanna walked beside him in silence. Her presence no longer something he was trying to understand, but something he accepted fully, not because he knew everything about her, but because he did not need to. The truth of her had already shown itself in the same way as had, through action, through stillness, through choice. They moved closer to the edge of the land, where the path opened wider, where the camp no longer defined the space, and the horizon stretched out in every direction, endless. And for a brief moment, Ethan paused, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because he realized that this was the point where everything behind him and everything ahead of him met, not separate, not divided, but connected. He looked once at Ayanna, and she met his gaze with the same steady calm she had always held, and in that exchange, nothing needed to be said. The understanding was complete, not in detail, not in explanation, but in truth. He turned forward again, taking the next step without looking back, because he knew now that the path he had chosen did not require certainty. It required presence, the willingness to keep moving, to keep standing, to keep choosing. And as the land opened before them and the wind carried the quiet promise of everything yet to come, Ethan Cole walked forward without hesitation, not because he knew where it would lead, but because he knew why he would continue. And that was enough. The land did not change as they walked forward, but something in the way it held them did, like it recognized what had just been chosen without needing to be told. And Ethan Cole felt that recognition not as praise, not as reward, but as a quiet acceptance that settled into his bones and stayed there. The wind moved steady across the open stretch, bending the grass in long, slow waves, and beside him, Ayanna walked with the same calm certainty she had always carried. But now there was no distance between them, no unspoken barrier, only a shared path that neither of them questioned anymore. Behind them, the camp remained where it had always been, its rhythm continuing without pause. But Ethan did not feel pulled back by it, did not feel the need to look over his shoulder, because he understood now that what mattered was not where he had come from, but how he carried it forward. They walked until the sounds of the camp faded completely, replaced by the open quiet of the plains, a silence that did not press against him anymore, but moved with him, and for the first time, it felt like something he belonged to rather than something he stood against. After a while, Ayanna slowed, her steps easing until she stopped near a rise where the land stretched wide in every direction. No markers, no boundaries, just distance and sky. She turned slightly, her eyes moving over the horizon before settling on him. And in that gaze, there was no question left, no test waiting to be answered, only something steady, something that had been there from the beginning but could only be seen now that everything else had fallen away. "This is where most think it ends," she said softly, her voice carried by the wind but never lost within it. Ethan followed her gaze across the open land, taking in the endless stretch of it, the kind of space that made a man believe he could ride forever and still not reach its edge. And he understood what she meant. This felt like an ending, a point where the challenge had passed, where the choice had been made and nothing more was required. But he had learned too much to believe that now. He shook his head slightly, a small movement, but certain. "It does not end," he said, not as a guess, but as something he knew without needing to be told. Ayanna watched him for a long second, then gave a faint nod, the smallest trace of something shifting in her expression. Not surprise, not approval, but recognition, the kind that comes when two people reach the same understanding from different paths. "No," she said quietly. "It begins." The words settled into the air between them, simple, clear, and final in a way that did not close anything, but opened everything that would come next. Ethan let out a slow breath, not heavy, not strained, just steady. Because he felt the truth of it in a way that did not need explanation. This had never been about a single moment, never been about proving himself in one place or one time. It was about carrying that same truth forward, into every step, every choice, every moment that would follow. The beaded cord in his hand felt different now. Not heavier, not lighter, just part of him. Like something that no longer needed to be held to be carried. Ayanna turned back toward the open land, taking a step forward without hesitation, and Ethan moved with her, not following, not leading, just walking beside her. The distance ahead no longer something to measure, but something to move through. The wind rose slightly, brushing past them, carrying the warmth of the day and the quiet strength of the land itself. And for a moment, everything felt still within that movement, like the world had settled into place around them. They walked without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was nothing left that needed words. The understanding between them was complete, not in detail, not in answers, but in direction, and that was enough. Far behind them, unseen but still present, the camp continued its life, the people within it moving through their own paths, their own choices, their own moments of standing and not turning away. And Ethan realized that what he had stepped into was not separate from them. It was part of the same thing, the same quiet truth that did not need to be named to be understood. He glanced once at Ayanna, and she met his gaze without hesitation, the same steady calm, the same quiet strength. And in that exchange, something settled fully, not a conclusion, not an ending, but a certainty, the kind that does not need to be questioned again. He turned forward once more, the horizon stretching wide before him, and took another step, then another, not counting them, not measuring them, just moving, because that was what mattered now, not where the path led, not how far it went, but that he stayed on it, that he did not turn away when it became difficult, when it became unclear, when it asked more of him than he expected to give. And as the sun climbed higher and the land opened endlessly ahead, Ethan Cole walked forward without hesitation, not because he had found the end of something, but because he had finally understood what it meant to begin. And out here, where the wind carried no promises and the land held no guarantees, that was the only kind of certainty a man ever truly needed.